for joining us on this beautiful spring afternoon. My name is Christine Kennedy, and on behalf of the Office of Alumni Engagement, I'd like to welcome you to our talk, Greening the Future, Sustainable Gardens for a Healthier World. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the land on which this webinar is taking place. I'm down on campus at McMaster, obviously, what other campus? That this area is on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. This talk today is our fourth talk in our Rejuvenate series, which is being sponsored by our affinity partner, TD Insurance. So I'd like to thank them for their commitment to our programming. And just a reminder, because this is a series, our Rejuvenate series, the more webinars you attend, the greater chance that you have of winning one of our wonderful prizes. We have 3 gift cards, spring themed related. We have a gift card for M.I.T, for Terra Greenhouses or Lee Valley. So every time you attend a webinar, your name will be put into a random draw. So if you attend all, I think we have 7 talks, then your chances of winning a card are greater. So thank you for joining us today. This talk is being recorded. So if you need to pop out for whatever reason, fear not. You'll be able to hear all of Cathy's skills, knowledge, tips, and tricks in a recording. I think we'll send that recording out around 3 p.m. this afternoon. And feel free to share that with family and friends. And also in that email with the recording, there'll be a survey, and we would appreciate if you could fill that survey out, as that helps us sort of identify what new topics you'd like us to look into, and finding presenters who can present on those topics. So I was saying to Cathy before the presentation started, gardening is always one of our most popular topics. And we had so many questions. So Cathy has tried to weave some of those questions into her presentation, but also because she couldn't answer them all, she has given us like this 8-page document, which was so generous of her time. So you will see when you get the recording, there is a resource section, because we're not on Zoom, we're on our other platform. So when you click onto the recording, at the bottom, there'll be resources. So we've placed that. My colleague Jessica put the resource in there, 8 pages. So if your question wasn't answered, feel free to go to that resource document, and you might find your answer in there. So with all of that, now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, a master gardener. Cathy Kavassilis is a dedicated gardener and conservationist, blending her experience as a scientist and educator to promote biodiversity and sustainable living. As an inspirational speaker and educator, Cathy endeavors to ignite interest and respect for our living environment. She co-founded the Canadian Coalition for Invasive Plant Regulation and is an active member of the Halton Master Gardeners, reflecting her commitment to combating invasive species and fostering ecological balance. Cathy's leadership roles include serving as the past president of the Oakville Horticultural Society and as a former member of the board of directors for the Royal Botanical Garden. Her dedication to gardening is showcased in her own eclectic and organic gardens, which have been featured on several tours. Through her work, Cathy aims to inspire a harmonious relationship with nature, emphasizing the importance of conservation and sustainable practices in everyday life. And it's only through the magic of Zoom, of online virtual talks, that Cathy's here today, because she is up north, enjoying her home up there. So Cathy, thanks for joining us. Except I can't remember. I remember Perry Sound. You said outside of Perry Sound, I think.
That's right, in Seguin, or Seguin, as the locals say. So yes, I'm really delighted to be here with you this afternoon, and I've pulled up my first slide. Is everyone able to see?
It's all good to go. Yep.
Okay, we'll get started. And good afternoon. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this series. I hope to bring you today a message of hope and resilience through the simple yet profound act of gardening. Of course, the image on this first screen is not simple. It is the brainchild of the visionary landscape architect Vincent Calibo, who conceived of this floating lily pad city as a climate refugia for the millions of people and plants that are likely to be displaced by rising sea levels. And we stand at the crossroads today where the cumulative perils of climate change and the growing threats to the tapestry of life on our planet call on us to imagine such grand and complex solutions. And I'm advancing a slide. If it hasn't advanced, let me know. But what I want to tell you is that it is within our means to enact and provide ecological refugia in our own gardens. Our gardens can be more than aesthetic spaces. They can be vital organs that are pulsating with life and nurturing a web of relationships. Through our plant choices and garden techniques, we can strive to protect the health of the planet and just make some simple changes that will make life all around us more beautiful and resilient. So let's begin this journey and sow the seeds of change right in our own back and front yards. But we do need to step back and set the stage, think about what's going on in the world. Our Earth has a fever. Over the past century, it's risen by a degree, and we expect it to rise further. We're going to see more fires, droughts, and floods. But climate change is not a threat of itself, it's also a threat multiplier. We're going to see increasing spread of certain invasive species, particularly invasive plants, and an acceleration of biodiversity loss, the weakening of ecosystems, and these together perpetuate a destructive cycle that can increase climate change. You know, the five horsemen of the apocalypse, it may seem, sort of too great a prospect, but this was in the IBIS report, the International Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform Group, looking at what was happening with biodiversity around the planet and saying, that we have not seen losses like this in the history of humankind. And how we use our land, in the land that's in our care, it really does matter, because our plant choices and our care regimes can have both positive and negative effects on biodiversity, on soil health, on carbon sequestration, and water conservation. We know that, life forms on Earth have adapted over millions of years to thrive in unique environmental conditions. Through evolution, we've got a lot of genetic and species diversity all around the globe with distinct communities and ecosystems. And our well-being depends on those healthy ecosystems. I want you to think about communities of plants and animals in the biomes across this planet. There are boreal forests, temperate forests, tropical forests, grasslands. These biomes are affected by climate. It filters which species can exist in each region. The temperature, the humidity, the precipitation, all of these things change what can grow in polar regions versus what can be in a tropical forest or a dry desert. But we've learned as gardeners that we can move plants between these biomes if the growing conditions are similar enough. McMaster University is in the region called the Mixed Wood Plains. It's a temperate forest region. Some of you may be in this GTA and some of you may be in very different biomes. But each one of these, trying to advance my slide, each one of these can hold a different group of plants. So let's play a game and think about this collection of plants, these roses. Where in the world do you think this garden might be? Now, did you guess Japan? Well, this is the Kasai Rose Garden in Japan, and Japan is home to things like the Japanese macaque and the endangered Okinawa rail, or the invasive, for us, multiflora rose. But I could have chosen a rose garden practically anywhere on the planet except Antarctica. There are rose gardens in Ottawa, in Barrie, in Burlington. It is a ubiquitous plant in gardening circles. Where in the world are these gardens? The upper gardens have kale and pansies, below dahlias, salvias, yarrow. This could be my backyard. I grow many of these in my Ontario garden. But these happen to be in Queensland, Australia, home for the koala, which is endangered, and the numbat, which is endangered, and the 700 species of eucalyptus tree. Or how about these gardens? Here's in Lily of the Valley and periwinkle. These are ground covers that are often used here in Ontario. It is an invasive species, and those pictures happen to come from Bruce Peninsula National Park, where it is disrupting food webs. It is a home to 30 species that are currently at risk. But again, we move these plants all around the globe. And if you're interested in stopping invasive plants, I'm not really going to talk a lot about this today, but please visit the Canadian Coalition for Invasive Plant Regulation, cipr.ca, to learn more and to help. I want to talk about what we should be planting as gardeners. Should a garden created for the McMaster University campus or your garden, be it in Ottawa or British Columbia, look like a garden designed for Queensland, Australia? Unique flora and fauna have developed around this globe. Eucalyptus trees date back over 50 million years. That's when the first fossil records of it occur. And koala-like animals have date back to 25 million years. And that koala is a hyper specialist that's tied to the poisonous eucalyptus trees. These kind of specialized diets have evolved over centuries, over millions of years. So this is why an African desert looks very different from an American desert. And the flora and fauna are uniquely tied in a relationship with one another and dependent on soil, water, climate conditions in very intricate ways. But we're changing this. We're forgetting that relationships take time to establish. And we're moving plants around the globe at a startling rate. While we're doing this, we're causing sort of a homogenization. We're reducing biodiversity. And gardening is the largest pathway for the introduction of invasive plants, invasive pests, and invasive diseases. So things like the jumping worms and the hammerhead worms, these are likely coming through the nursery trades. We are creating winners and losers, some really big winners and some really big losers, and quite a lot in between. We're creating winners like the Canada goose, who really do very well on our expansive lawns, as does the Japanese beetle. But things like the rusty patch bumblebee, the Acadian flycatcher, the prickly rose, the climbing rose, these are disappearing from our landscapes. When we look, here's a study that was done some years back now, looking at tree diversity in our major cities. A gentleman by the name of Eric Davies looked at the trees at the time of European settlement. For instance, in Toronto, there were 73 native species at the time of European settlement. Since then, we've introduced 74. So we've increased biodiversity, right? We've increased this number of distinct species. But in fact, while introducing new species, we've actually made 32 species disappear. This dark diversity is happening all around North America. Native species are being displaced. We are protecting some ones that we find attractive, but we're losing many others. And life is disappearing. Almost half the planet's species are experiencing rapid population declines. The International Union for Conservation of Nature now includes 157 species on their red list as threatened, with 44 threatened with extinction. A report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services again says that nature's contributions to people are declining at rates never before seen in human history. So many studies indicating nature is in trouble. If you look at Hamilton, sort of the home to McMaster, we've only got about 17% of sort of natural cover, that is places where green things can grow. Where are native flora and fauna to survive? Well, you might think, well, there are woods outside of the area. Maybe they can go there, but in fact, much of that is given over to agriculture, which is essential for our well-being. Very little land is protected to support native flora and fauna. The New York Times a few years back had this provocative headline, "Is your garden killing the earth?" And the answer is, if your garden is a food desert, it is. Our gardens have often become assortments of plants from around the world whose function is primarily for appearance. On the right is a garden that's almost entirely made up of boxwood, a non-native species. And the reason gardeners liked it was because it was perfect. You could shape it every year. There weren't holes in the leaves. Nothing ate anything. It was a food desert. Now, of course, that's changing because what's following along it are many of the invasive pests like boxwood psyllid, boxwood leaf miner, boxwood mite, boxwood moth, and a whole plethora of diseases. And this is how life evolves. But this is displacing native species. So thoughtful landscape designs need to act as connectors between our fragmented habitats, what we have left. It needs to enhance ecosystem function, soil formation, water regulation, pollination. It needs to support relationships between plants and plant food webs. Now, we know plants are critical to fundamental life-giving processes. They're part of the water cycle. They are part of carbon cycles, of nitrogen cycles, and all of these things are going on in the background. Plants are fundamental to our life. But more importantly, they are fundamental to the lives of other species. Plants are producers of energy. They support the consumers, the herbivores, the decomposers that break down leaves and create soil. They're part of this energy flow system that happens all around us. So gardens are necessary to build and support these relationships. Think about, a plant in your garden. It's got shoot feeders. It's got seed eaters. It should have symbionts, the pollinators, the seed dispersers. And under the ground, often very much neglected, are the decomposers, the mycorrhizal fungi that act as communication conduits, as well as helping plants acquire resources. There's so much happening that we need to think about and support. And as I said, plants, we're learning, have relationships with one another. They're communities of friends and neighbors. We used to think of plants simply battling one another for resources, but now we're learning that they can cooperate, display kin behavior and social behavior in very complex ways. So they're sharing space above the ground, communicating and sharing resources below ground. So let's think about plant choices. We make decisions about what we plant in our garden, often based on appearance, but also function. Sometimes we need shade or play areas. How do we make our choices? Well, we know that we overuse lawns. We shouldn't be using artificial lights that are disrupting insect life and bird life. We're using too much impermeable landscaping, hardscaping, not allowing water to percolate into the soil, not allowing bees or insects that require access to soil to raise their broods to have that access. It's the overuse of a limited selection of non-native species that don't support biodiversity. We need to change this. So how do we improve? Doing the opposite. We reject invasive plants first and foremost. We reduce lawns. We choose to be water-wise, choose plants that are appropriate for site conditions, and we build relationships, build plant communities that support native food webs, support pollinators, and support above and below ground life. And we use native keystone plants to do this, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Whoops, 2 slides. So what should we do to look for the plants for the future? We have new climate, new soils, new moisture conditions, new pests and disease pressures. While historically McMaster was and is in a region called the mixed wood plains, should we stay and look for plants that were originally here, or should we introduce more new species for the novel soils, weather patterns, and pests and disease? Things like hardy bananas. I can see a lot more being planted now along Lake Erie and even in Hamilton. And I'm going to say no. And I'll tell you the reason. When conditions change, environmental conditions, climate changes, species have 4 choices. They can adapt, they can migrate, They can evolve or they perish. Right now, we need to throw a life preserver to the plants, the native species that are here. Our gardens are essentially climate change refugia. We need them to serve as a slow lane, to protect native species and ecosystems, to give them a time to adapt and or migrate. This is not about returning to some mythic, pristine, pre-European time. That boat sailed long ago. This is about providing the necessities of life so that we can slow down the loss of biodiversity and protect human health. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the work of Doug Ptolemy and Desiree Narengo, where they've looked at, the relationship between insects and birds. For instance, we know that a breeding chickadee requires 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to rear a clutch of young in the course of about 16 days. That's 500 caterpillars a day. And what the research has shown is that they actually require native biomass, native trees for the most part, in order to do that. Without 70% native plant biomass, chickadee populations decline. And in fact, bird populations in general are declining. So we start with trees and shrubs. How do you know what you should be planting? Well, if you're in Ontario, I would suggest looking at the Forest Gene Conservation Association website. It's in one of those many resources I attached in that sheet. For McMaster, you would look in Eco District 7E-3, and there's a little interactive map where you can choose these lists. And they also have a species information guide, which will tell you what kinds of soil and light and drainage conditions those species need. And so you can tailor it to your particular situation. Supporting birds, well, as I mentioned earlier, we've lost 3 billion birds in North America since 1970. Cornell has done a lot of research on this, and they need trees to support their existence, and they need native plants for a lot of reasons. But there's another reason you should support birds, and there was a cool study that just came out in 2020 that people are happier with more birds in their yards. You get a 10% rise in bird species, it gives you a 50% happier rating. And that's compared to a 10% increase in your income. So again, if you just want to be happier, plant for birds. And keystones are critical to do this because our birds tend to eat caterpillars, soft-bodied insects, and we know that about 14% of the local genera of plants support more than 90% of moths and butterfly diversity. This doesn't mean that non-keystone plant genera and that plants aren't critical hosts for specialized herbivores or simply for diversity itself. But in the words of Doug Ptolemy, if we build our landscapes without these powerhouse plants that support caterpillar food webs, the food web is doomed. And a keystone, think about, those keystone arches. These are like the stone in the center that maintains the integrity of the structure. These keystones maintain the integrity of ecosystems. Where do you find lists? National Wildlife Foundation in the US has developed lists of key genera for various regions. Again, McMaster's in the Eastern Temperate region, but you can find your region on that web page in the resource sheet. If we pulled up those sheets, we'd see a list of trees, shrubs, and flowering perennials. Keystone genera for trees are things like oaks, cherries, willows, birches, poplars, and maples, with oaks supporting over 400 species of Lepidoptera, moths, and butterflies across the temperate region. A red oak, 436 species, that's a life support system. Amur maple, a pretty tree, but an invasive species, which by definition is doing more harm than good, may support swallowtails because it's in the Rutaceae family, hard to say, but that is doing harm. So your choice to do good or to do harm. And in addition to moths and butterflies, they've done research in looking at keystone species that support pollinators. Now, the Southern Ontario is actually a native bee hotspot. We have over 350 species of native bees, 30% unique to Canada, about 26 to 30% of those are specialists. I'll talk more about that shortly. It's these specialists that require particular plants to reproduce. Why is that? There is this cool evolutionary dance between pollen producers and pollen consumers. Pollen is, after all, the way that plants share their precious genetic resources, and it takes them energy to create those pollen-rich pollen packets. They want them to be carried by pollinators to, the female plants or the female receptacles. But they don't want them all to be eaten. So if they make them too delicious, too easy to digest, then they really are just wasting energy to feed something else rather than to actually spread their genetic material. So some pollens are toxic, some are indigestible to almost all bees, or they have coatings and all kinds of interesting variations. And this little micrograph that I've put on this page shows you some of the differences in the shapes and sizes. And if you look at this sort of little, they've colorized these, this little red one with the three, lobes to it, that's for our sundrop, Oenothera fruticosa. The specialist bee that uses that is the evening primrose sweat bee. Again, it has co-evolved with this plant so that it can digest and use that pollen. Pollen specialists, they're tied mostly to the Asteraceae family, the daisy family. So things like the goldenrods, they serve 28 different types of specialist bees: black-eyed Susans, Rudbeckia 17, Aster 16, willow, salix, underutilized in landscapes 12. This is life and death for these pollen specialists. On the picture on the left, that's Endrina erythroniae. It is intricately tied to trout lilies, the Erythronium genus. So again, if that plant isn't there, those bee populations are going to decline unless they can adapt rapidly enough to use something else. People are always looking for lists. What should I plant? Now, I can't give you lists for every place you are in the US, but I put resources for where you might look for those. The National Wildlife Foundation Plant Finder is a resource that was made for the US, but it works very nicely for the southern tier of Ontario. And you can go to this website and it will, for a particular zip code, and you can just put a postal, look down on the maps to choose one that's relevant to your area. And it will pull up a variety of plants that sort of maximize the number of species that you can support. For instance, wild strawberry, 84 species of moths and butterflies. It's a great choice for spring. Thin leaf sunflower, 50 species of bees, 70 species of moths and butterflies for midsummer. For fall, use the goldenrods or the asters, 138 species of moths and butterflies, 42 species of bees. And how you combine these, we don't have time to talk about in this short period, but there is some very interesting research on how we should assemble plants. And I put some links in the resources, and maybe we'll have me back sometime and we'll talk more detail about this. First, you look at your site conditions, the soil, the light, the moisture that you have, and choose plants appropriate for that. There's some research in terms of how plants should be grouped together, so that there are some that are going to do well in groups and clumps, some that should be individual because they're more resource hogs, and some that are just good ground covers. And again, Planting in a Post-Wild World, Thomas Rayner and Claudia West is a good resource to learn some of the thinking around those. So you're building your communities to support diversity, providing food, shelter, and water. If you can leave some soil surface for ground nesting species, if you can leave dead wood in your garden or dead things standing, that's critical. Now, we don't have big spaces like this, but you can do this on any level. But maintaining the perfect space is something we need to stop. It has costs. We need to aim instead for sustainable site management, because no holes means no life. No holes in the leaves of milkweeds, no monarchs. No holes in the leaves of birch trees, no luna moths. No holes in the leaves of these grapes, no leafcutter bees. Our modern manicured landscapes reflect really old ideas. Too much lawn, too many non-native plants, and they're too clean, too much maintenance. Climate-smart gardening means that we need to change our garden design to increase native diversity, but also, and more importantly, reduce maintenance, reduce your watering, fertilizing, mowing, and blowing. You limit that lawn space and replace it with native ground cover or edible gardens. And think before cleaning up. When it is time to clean up or cut things back, consider, this is from Rebecca McBacken, and I really love the idea, the concept of a garden mullet. Leave your backyard long and your front yard short. Chop and drop, cut your perennials back in 6-inch sections and let it lie, let it be the mulch. Leave stem stubble. Heather Holmes, very generous expert in pollinators, suggests that we leave stems that are 1/8 of an inch or 3 millimeters in diameter at about 24 inches height. In this small inset, you can see those little tubular cavities with that little hollow pith are essential for many insects and bees that require stems to raise their broods. And again, leave habitat where if you grow native grasses and you cut their tops off because you're thinking they're looking a little shaggy, leave the skirts. There's some great videos from Rebecca Holmes. They discovered when they reclaimed sort of the Brooklyn portage, which was all hardscaped over, and they returned it to more natural forms, that if they left the skirts, they found that you had all kinds of ground nesting and ground sparrows, and new bird species were coming in, as well as new insects that were finding these essential habitats. And another story that I like to tell, because I think it can convey some of the complexity here. I often, as a master gardener, get asked questions about, well, my tree has all these funny little bumps and nodules on it. Is it bad? How do I get rid of it? And the advice often given is, well, let's break all the leaves up. Well, in this case, this picture here are the bumps and knobs, or they're called galls, on the back of a hackberry leaf. This is made by a hackberry psyllid. This little insect is crucial for refueling migratory songbirds. They're going to come along and they're going to eat these little insects, part of the checks and balances in nature. And more than that, there is a little parasitic wasp that is going to follow along where these little psyllids are living. And they are going to nest and multiply in the leaves that fall below the tree. So when you clean those leaves up and rake them away, you're actually removing the predator that's going to help maintain this in a way that's not too disfiguring for the tree. So you're disrupting all kinds of complex food webs when you think about cleaning up that debris. Because leaf litter is not waste. This is the way that trees and plants return their leaves and the minerals contained in them and the nutrients back to the soil so that they can reuse them. It insulates the tree roots. It reduces water loss. It shelters overwintering species. It supports mycorrhizal association, and it protects spring ephemerals and other plants in the garden. Leaf litter maintains this critical underground web of roots, fungi, and bacteria and other microbial life. It helps connect trees with one another. It helps them better absorb nutrients and water from the soil. So it is critical for us to take care of our soil and maintain these dynamic systems. Each of us can contribute to this process. It is about space and scale. I had a little girl who, not so little anymore, lived up the street, and she was devastated in school, learning of all the things that were going wrong around the world. And her mother sent her over to me, and I had her scoop up a small amount of soil. And we talked about all the things that were in our soil and how big the world is and how wonderful and diverse it is. And I told her that in that teaspoon of soil that was in her hand, she was holding more creatures than there are people on this planet. And by caring for that soil, she is making a difference. And while she was holding that, hopefully there was some Mycobacterium vaccaei, which we know lowers stress and helps our immune system. So as gardeners, just by being with the soil, we're actually healing ourselves. But it is understanding that in these small ways we can make and contribute to a big difference on this planet that I think is empowering. Because collectively, if we improve the ecosystem function, improve public health, safeguard our water systems, protect biodiversity, and provide for climate resilience, we are doing a lot together. So if you have the space and the yard, make a rain garden. Reduce flooding potential, improve water quality, create habitat, decrease maintenance, and increase your home value. If you have the space, make a rooftop garden. This will regulate temperature, reduce noise, and use it for food production. Make a vertical garden. This is a great way. Hang it on your fence. Grow vegetables, grow herbs. Enhance both visual appearance and create psychological and practical benefits. Bosco Verticali, this went from, these visionary prototypes to actual reality. And Vincent Calabo also has some of these buildings that have been built. These are vertical forests. We need to encourage our cities to include and require space for plants to grow. This particular tower has 800 trees, 5,000 shrubs. It mitigates smog and produces oxygen. It is a veritable haven for biodiversity. There are large-scale projects going on all around North America, like this Corktown project in Toronto. Encourage your cities to take brown spaces and convert them into these kinds of natural ecological communities. The Highline project in New York City has become a mecca for tourism, as well as this wonderful little refugia within a city. So they can have economic benefits as well as ecological benefits. One balcony can produce food and support pollinators. One of the questions was, well, what are simple things I can grow? Well, grow some cherry tomatoes, grow some dill, and grow a little extra for the swallowtail butterflies that might come along. Grow something for pollinators, put in some asters. Tiny spaces can make a difference. Designing is where art meets science, and we need to first expand our knowledge of native plants and, of course, non-invasive plants, and figure out how to combine these so that they are beautiful, but ecosystem, again, supporting ecosystem function. And this isn't easy, but we're seeing more and more resources online. Wild Ones is a great resource. Again, it's in that list I've given you. And landscape designers from across North America have been posting their designs so that you can learn from them. And many of the plants that they're using occur in a wide range across the temperate zone, and you can reapply their principles to build your own spaces. I just heard a talk by Aaron Fox in the Hamilton area where he showed how he had redone his front yard as this wonderful rain garden, and it has received accolades from neighbors. And we need more of these designs to show what can work and how they work, and to follow them over time. Again, often these require very little maintenance once established, and the maintenance is a sort of an annual thing rather than a weekly action. Another one that just got posted under Gardenista, where landscapers were putting their favorite native plant combos so that people could see what things were working together to provide spaces that were visually attractive as well as functional for pollinators and for native diversity. Appearance, I know, is important. And Mount Cuba Research Center has been working because a lot of native plants have not been bred for habit, for flowering. I think we need to give up the idea that everything has to be full of flowers, but that may not happen for a while. So you can apply design principles to make your space very attractive, to sort of meet Western standards, by using geometric shapes, sort of repetitious patterns, by using, planters in the landscape, repeating them, using mass plantings, take the same plant and repeat the idea to create a symmetrical planting, and using evergreens to sort of have some winter planting. Again, line form, texture, color, these are all design things that can be put into any landscape and make it beautiful. High impact ornamentals can be put in the foreground and allowed back to be wilder. That's a lesson from the Brooklyn Bridge Park Gardens, and Rebecca McMacken, one of my favorite landscapers, horticulturalists. I encourage you to watch her videos and learn from her. Because great style can be ecologically sound and it can be very diverse, but it's essential that we keep the ecologically sound first and foremost, because we all can be trendsetters in supporting a healthy planet. We are part of nature. We are shaping the evolution of our planet, and our choices impact soil health, water quality, what lives and dies. So please plant wisely for generations to come. Safeguard biodiversity by shrinking your lawn, increasing your use of native plants, aiming for 70%, reject invasive plants, be innovative, and advocate for change. So join SIPR, stop the spread of the sales of invasive plants, or change your regional bylaws so that your front yards can be a little bit more naturalized. There's lots that we can do together. Thank you, and I will stop my slides and answer some of your questions.
Oh my gosh, Cathy. Okay. So last week so last night I did a talk, last week I did a talk, and I always take furious notes about all the things that I was not doing correctly. And this is the perfect time for this talk, because at the beginning of spring, we start planting things. So native plants, I definitely have that old European, and I don't have a particularly great garden, but it's definitely aesthetic. I have never considered what's invasive, what is not. It's kind of like, well, what's pretty? I like dahlias, and I like violets, and I'm like, oh my goodness, nope. Okay, we're throwing out the bath and the baby. I'm throwing it all out, and I am going to get native plants. Okay, so let's start. So I don't know if I mentioned to everyone, if you want to ask a question, there is a Q&A. I think there's a question. So just, log on to that, type in your question, and Cathy will certainly answer that. I guess at the end there, you talked about how we can sort of keep those aesthetics that we like. How long do you think it's going to take? I will say, in my neighborhood, some people are starting to embrace a more natural, with a lot of pollinators, where it's a little more wild, right? And they must be following that person. I can't remember. They said the Brooklyn.
Yeah, Tom Rayner. And this is. I'm glad you mentioned this, Christine, because there is this sense that you have to give up some of the sort of the European design principles, and they're not just European. I mean, the design principles are things that are aesthetics sort of globally, but there isn't a need to just let things go wild in the sense that it just looks like a meadow. Pete Rudolph has these sort of naturalized landscapes. They're really quite beautiful, but they're not everybody's taste. And so, as I said, Mount Cuba has done some very interesting research to show, well, can we sort of fit the traditional sort of Western European concept in using native plants? And in fact, you can, but you do it in interesting ways. And so, just by sort of getting sort of large urns and putting them through the garden in a series, for instance, that gives you that more formalistic and repetitive look, and then have things that sort of flow around it, can offer that bridge between the two concepts. And again, a hodgepodge planting versus sort of planting in clusters of color, so that you think of it as a painting, like an impressionist or Monet painting, where you're taking different color values. Put a wave of asters next to a wave of goldenrod. In the spring, you're going to have Aquilegia canadensis, the beautiful columbine in that sort of wave of red, and put it next to pussy toes. And then when you see the hummingbirds come, celebrate the moments that happen. The garden doesn't look beautiful every moment in time, but if you think about the season progression and you celebrate those instants of beauty, it's fabulous. And I think we need to look at the small and the minute sometimes when we're, want this kind of perfect picture. That static has to go. I mean, the Japanese embrace wabi-sabi, right? The beauty of imperfection. There's something about the ephemeralness of a garden, the changing every day, which is something you can go out and look for something beautiful in that garden that may be minute and small, and maybe it is simply a bee that's fallen asleep inside the cone of a flower, and say, wow, I've done something. I've provided sanctuary for that creature in this world. And it's in making that connection that I think might help us bridge our desire to have this, oh, I've got to have this huge peony. And I do, I have my peonies. I have some of those big floriferous plants, right? I have the giant flowers, but I no longer seek those. It's a journey. And now I only add natives, but I'm not at the 70% mark yet. It's we're all moving towards that, I hope, but it's not always within our means. I can answer some of the. Sorry, you go on. There may be questions, and I get off on tangent. Sorry.
I just like how you use yet. So I guess maybe I shouldn't be throwing everything out. It's over maybe the course of 5 years. That's how I get to the 70%.
Over the course of 10 years, whatever, make the steps you can, and not everyone is capable. I mean, as I'm in my senior years, like what I used to bite off when I was little, I can no longer do that. So, I've inherited a garden when I moved up north that was entirely non-native and invasive. And I have a 10-year plan to remove those and slowly replace things. And I am under no illusions that I will ever be able to get rid of all of the invasives. They are there to stay, and I'm going to be in a maintenance mode with them.
Right. Okay, well, we do have some questions come in. Let's ask these.
Please.
So Leslie's asking, how do you get rid of invasive species like Queen Anne lace? Oh, yes. It takes over.
Many invasive species take over, and it's a question of each species has a different technique and different timing. So first and foremost, prevent them from going to seed. So, when the Queen Anne lace produces the lovely flower, cut it off, enjoy it in your home. It has a taproot, and so if you can, individually dig them out. If all you have is invasive species and it's in a sunny space, you might consider leveling everything to the ground and tarping it over, or actually solarizing it using a thin plastic sheet like those painter sheets, and watering the ground, cooking it. You can look up solarizing to learn how to do it, or email me, I'll give you instructions, and start again. So there's all kinds of there are herbicides that are allowed in Ontario for sort of topical use. Most of them are only effective on top growth, and so you can do spot treatments on them. I usually just tackle each one by hand, or do kind of a global solution to a larger problem.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully that helps you, Leslie. So Suzanne is asking, how about backyard that is low on soil grade and filled with weeds? How do we address this as we are new to this home space?
So you're starting from scratch, essentially. And there are several ways. I know I'll try and answer two questions at once, because I think in the ones you gave me ahead of time, someone was asking about lasagna gardening. And this is a good application for something like that. So if the garden is just a write-off, like the soil is lousy, it may be builder's clay or whatever, and you really are starting with a novel conditions, what I would do is cut everything down, get rid of as much as you can, And again, this all depends on cost, budget, and size. So break it into sections that are doable and manageable for you within your physical abilities and your time. Maybe it's only, 3 meters by 3 meters. Maybe it's less than that. Start small so it doesn't get overwhelming for you. I would take those leaf bags or cardboard and I would cover up the area that you want to work on. On top of that, you can either use the lasagna method, and I've put a link in the resources that describes, the green, brown layers. I often will get a dump truck of soil from one of my local landscapers. I go and look at the soil so I know what the quality is and make sure that it's okay. And I'll essentially cover it over with 3 inches of soil, 3 inches of mulch, and plant into that and start again. So for something new, that's sort of how I would do it. And again, start small, because I think oftentimes new gardeners try and break off too much. It gets overwhelming. They can't maintain it. And then they just kind of quit. So make it small. Remember that when you're starting a new garden and new plants, water for the first 3 years is critical. So the plants need no water once they get established. That first 2 to 3 years, you're going to have to water regularly, particularly during August when things get very hot, so that they get well established, deep rooted, and then you can just let them be. If you've chosen right, you shouldn't have to water, except under extreme drought conditions, which happen off and on.
Well, and because Suzanne's starting fresh, she can put all the native species
Do
in.
it right.
That's right.
Yeah,
Oh,
you can
Suzanne,
do
that's
it.
exciting.
And yes, and depending where you are, you can find, and again, I put lists there. It's really hard to, for a general audience to tell you, well, you should plant this, this, and this. And, you want to look locally as to what would make sense.
So Karen's asking, and you kind of briefly touched on this with the pesticide. So Karen is asking, is there any situation where you would use a pesticide to eradicate an invasive plant? I'm having trouble getting rid of some Japanese pokeweed in my backyard, and there are days when I wish I could just get something to kill it.
Oh, I am
Honest
glad you
Karen.
brought up, yes, Japanese knotweed. I think is one of the greatest threats in Ontario today, and it's being highly neglected by the provincial government. And I really do need to be more vocal about this, as do we all. I was a strong advocate for the pesticide bylaw. I will tell you that up front. Was out there with my placards and feel somewhat responsible for helping that come to pass. And I do wish they had made exceptions for invasive plants. And in particular, Japanese knotweed is one of them that I have. That's one of the plants in my backyard that I have, after 5 years, successfully eradicated by a lot of digging and continual cutting. What we've learned about Japanese knotweed, and it is a complex, so it is not just one species. There are actually 3 or 4, and the hybrid is truly the worst, the giant knotweed. But yeah, you can email me and I can give you lots of instructions. We know from research the best way to deal with it is in the fall to injections of glyphosate. That, of course, can only be done with a permit. So you can get a permit or get somebody who has a pesticide license to help you, but the individual cannot do that under the law. But 2 applications of the glyphosate that is available, for instance, to treat poison ivy, and that's why we allow it for poison ivy and things that are hazardous to property and human health, but we aren't doing it for other invasive species. This one should be exempted. It is not. If you cut it and don't come back to it, it actually promotes lateral growth. And so it's not one that one should be mowing unless you're on it constantly. And when I say constantly, I mean weekly. So you need to be cutting off its tip every time you see it. This grows in the volcanic region in Japan. That's where it's native to. It can go dormant for 20 years. This is a very difficult plant to contend with. And it's one that once it's in an area, you're just going to have to watch it. This is why you have to disclose that you have it on your property in England, because it is such a problem. You can't sell a home without saying that you have knotweed. Anyway, there are ways to deal with it, and I think my email must be somewhere. Email me and I can give you. Otherwise, go to the Master Gardeners website on social media, the Facebook forum. We have a fact sheet on it, and we're happy to share what we know. Also, the Ontario Invasive Plant Council has management sheets. They have one for knotweed. It's out of date. It was written before we understood that mowing actually caused lateral spread. So just keep that in mind as not being a solution for it.
All right, thank you. Karen, I will email you and I will, because I don't think we have your email anywhere, Cathy.
Okay.
So Karen, I will
Please
email
share it.
you and
Yeah.
I'll let you and Cathy connect.
And then I can just send the fact sheet.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so Linda is asking, oh yes, so this is about, oh, I can never pronounce this word. Are many nurseries stopping the use of nicotinamide?
The neonics. Yeah, we're
Kill the
seeing
bees,
fewer
or
and
do they use it? Do they use it? Are they required to list it on the labels?
oh, that's a good question. It's been a while since I looked at the neonics. Many of the box stores have stopped using it. I still am seeing it put on the seed coats of some plants that are sold, the ones that aren't organic labeled. So you do have to query it. I don't know for sure. I'd have to look and see what the current usage is. It's much less used than it was, but I do see it in some things still. So again, you have to check with your nursery about whether it's in the plants you're purchasing or on the seeds that you're buying. Sorry, I can't be more definitive.
Nope, that's good. That helps. Okay, so Ruth is asking, ooh, yummy asparagus. So she has been growing asparagus for about 10 years and it keeps getting thicker and thicker. Should she thin it out somehow? I do grow a lot of black-eyed Susans though, purchasing at a school sale, but I also bought ivy and is crawling up trees now. How do I get rid of it as its roots? Oh, shoot, as, what did I say? As its roots. How do I get rid of it?
Intertwined.
As
Yeah,
it roots every
I
few
get it.
inches. Sorry.
Yeah.
Roots as a verb as
Yeah.
opposed to a noun. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, first the asparagus. You're not eating enough. So what
Ruth can come to my house
what
and make some quiche, some asparagus quiche.
yeah, Ruth, when what sort of tends to keep it in check is that you're harvesting for the first 6 to 8 weeks after it starts coming out of the ground, and that naturally prevents the plant from having enough resources to really go to town. So yeah, consume more of the shoots when they come up, and you can start thinning some back so that it doesn't produce all the ferns. Clean it up a little bit more. Generally, you don't split asparagus. It's tricky, like they're really deep rooted. So I would just say be a little bit more brutal with it in the spring, and as it keeps growing, harvest longer and then cut some of the growing stems off if you want to sort of open up the patch a little bit. As for the ivy, I assume you're referring to Hedera helix or Hedera, the Baltic ivy, both of which are terribly invasive. First and foremost, protect the tree. So cut it off right at the base of where it's growing up the tree so it doesn't go up the tree and prevent it from photosynthesizing, because they can get all the way up into the canopy and kill them. And then because it's intertwined in the roots, you have a problem. And the only solution for this is just continual and systematic pulling of the roots. Every time you see green, make it your sort of weekly, and I know it's awful, go by with a leaf bag and just pull all the leaves that you can. To do this repeatedly, but plants have to photosynthesize to support their roots. So eventually you will kill it. In areas where there is a lot of tree density and roots intertangled, where you can't really suppress the growth easily, the only option is sort of continual and systematic removing of any top growth so that plant can no longer gather energy from the sun and support its roots. But that takes time and persistence on your part. You can do this with certain of the sort of the control pesticides, but then you do risk damaging the surface roots of the tree. Most of them aren't too close to the core of the tree, so you can get away with it there. You can also do some tarping over very minimal disturbance of the tree right near the base. So you could cover up a section and leave it there for at least a growing season and sometimes more. But again, every time you do that, then the roots of trees, they have to exchange oxygen with the surface. So when you cover them, you're actually killing tree roots, and that can do harm to the tree. So there's all these things you have to balance. No simple solutions with invasive plants. They are invasive for a reason. And honestly, it takes time and persistence to address them, which is why they should not be sold.
Yeah, so sorry, there are a few more questions I want to get to, but if we know, if we know these problems about invasive species, then why are our nurseries still selling them?
Oh, there are many reasons. Part of the problem is the fact that invasive species are profitable species for the nursery industry. They are easy to grow and easy to propagate. Some are very attractive, and people, the public, demand ground covers that cover areas quickly, like goutweed, like English ivy, something that's evergreen. They want these solutions that are quick and easy. And these meet them. So the industry tells us, well, there's demand. So where there's demand, there's supply. And so it's multifaceted. And then the government, which sort of wants to protect the industry, hasn't wanted to become engaged. But our Ontario Auditor General named things like English ivy, lily of the valley, Amur maple, and said these should not be sold. Hopefully somebody takes notice. And that's what CIPR, the Canadian Coalition for Invasive Plants, is all about. We've written I have written a very lengthy white paper. If you look at my resource list, that's what I do. And you can see our solutions to the problem. And we need all the support we can get. So if you wish to help, please join us.
And also, I guess, education, right? So this is a forum where people are now
This
learning.
is a forum for
Yeah.
education. And a lot of it is education. People just don't know. Nurseries, we want labeling on plants so that when people go to the nursery, they know that a plant has the potential to be invasive or a plant is poisonous. And it's surprising, we require labeling on all sorts of things. People often buy things like monk's hood and digitalis, and they have no idea how toxic those plants are. And I would just like them to be labeled for the public.
Mm-hmm. So we've been talking a lot about plants as in, sort of flowers, but Barb has a question about vegetable gardening. Is there info on native species? Is it important to look into the area for small scale food production?
I'm not sure I'm understanding the question. Do you want to plant native species that are
So
edible
vegetable, yeah, I
or?
think, yeah, in her vegetable garden, so we've talked a lot about plants, flowers for sort of like a floral garden, but if you're doing a vegetable garden, is it important to look to native species?
Well, you can use native species as companion plants to help support pollinators that help what you want to grow. I'm trying to think of what Sandura's website is. There is a woman, I just love her, Soul, the organic. Again, you have to. I'm having a senior moment here. That's her specialty. Like she looks at a lot of native plants that are edible and good for gardens, and so I do have that somewhere in my system, and can give that to you. So give her my email, and I'll connect her. Uh, as for growing vegetables in general, the standard tomatoes and corn and that kind of thing, natives make excellent companions to that, simply because you're then getting your native pollinators to come in and help to pollinate your squashes and your cucumbers and all of that sort of thing. So it's nice to use them, and they're also very good for drawing in pest control. A lot of problems in the gardens are solved by bringing in, people don't like them, but wasps are great predators for consuming a lot of the soft-bodied creatures that feed on things. Our native ladybugs, we actually will deal with some fungi as well as pests. There's a whole bunch of things that are interconnected. I did put a whole section in there on attracting beneficial insects and Then there's Jessica Walliser has a whole book on companion planting for vegetable gardens, looking specifically at how to attract them. So there's a lot of resources there for you that are all pretty publicly accessible.
So Barb just put a follow-up question in. Do native species have meaning in vegetable gardening? Sounds like maybe not.
Meaning, well, yes, I think certainly they do, and a lot of indigenous peoples have used.
Oh, meaning, sorry. Yes, I see what she means. Yes. Sorry. Yeah. I misunderstood the
So
question.
it is an area where I don't have a lot of expertise, and that's why I would have to, refer you to people who do more, use more sort of non-traditional vegetables. I have vegetable gardens, but I grow almost all entirely, aside from Jerusalem artichoke, Helianthus tuberosa, mostly non-native vegetables in my garden. And I will say, in terms of yes, Helianthus, uh, that it actually is only native to a very small region of Ontario. So if you are growing it, it's not technically native to a great deal of Ontario. When that comes in, there aren't a lot of plants that are native everywhere, but there are many edible native plants, and that there is a native and herbs. I did plant 2 years ago, and I really do like it. This Lindera benzoan. Trying to think what the common name is. Lindera. Anyway, it has a wonderful little fruit, which were used, the indigenous peoples taught the settlers to use as flavorings, and I really do like it. So there's a lot we don't know. We just haven't really learned about native plants, and many resources. I do have some from the Herb Society of North America has some really interesting recipes and things there. So again, not my area of expertise, though. I would have to refer you to others.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I'm writing some things down. Yes, to Ashmita and Shelley, I will send you Cathy's email. So we have two last questions. So Janice is asking, what can a condo owner do in using container gardening?
Oh, so much. That's a fun question. My daughter was now in California, but was in downtown Toronto, and I had an awful lot of fun experimenting on her balcony, which was really harsh conditions, very hot, very dry. I selected a couple of species of grapevines that she could grow on her balcony, and our Concord grape turns out to be very, very good. Some of the other himrods and other cultivars, table grapes, couldn't take the heat. But if you use, again, check with your condo board, because not all condos allow plants, particularly things that might drain on your neighbors underneath. So it is something that you do need to check to see what you are allowed to grow. Perennials more difficult than annuals, and again, it depends how you're facing, how able you are to get water to things. There are a lot of little evergreens that will grow very nicely. So if you just wanted to put a lot of the plants, again, I'm here I'm thinking GTA, but you may be somewhere further north. Think 2 zones colder than where you are, and for a condo, if you're on a balcony and harsh air conditions, think 3 zones. So look for plants, for instance, that might be hardy in Alberta, say zone 2 or zone 3. Those are going to overwinter in a very large container. And they do make insulated containers if you want to sort of push the envelope on things. Summertime, you can grow just about anything in a large container. In fact, I grow most of my vegetables in large containers just to avoid the rabbits eating things. And tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, potatoes. If you want to grow vegetables over the summer, you can. If you want to grow herbs, a whole plethora of herbs you can. One of the fruit, I grew a little fruit-bearing tree. There's some very hardy small cherries. You can go to, let's see, it's Hardy Fruits or Lewis Hardy Fruits. I'm not sure what the name is. Again, you'd have to email me. I can't keep it all in my head. But I bought, I think it's Prunus tomentosa. Anyway, it's a very small cherries. These are shrubby little cherries, produce great fruit. And that tree, I think it did much better than the grapes, lived on that balcony for 3 to 5 years and and we had to have two of them in order to get fruit production. It was great. So there are all kinds of things you can do in small spaces on a balcony, and it's just whatever your imagination wants, and if you're willing to water. And that's the biggest thing. When you go on holidays, you have to have somebody or a system, and there are systems put in place to make sure they get water when you're not around.
Great, thank you. Well, hopefully that helps. I can't remember who was asking that. Janice? Sorry, I have so many questions. I guess that was Janice that asked that question. Okay, more are coming in. Okay, so Doris has asked, oh wait, hold on. That was that. Oh no, okay, so someone with the initial C, oh, bindweed. C has bindweed. It started in my backyard and now it's in my front lawn, it's in my back garden. It started in their back garden and now it's in their back lawn. I've tried digging it out, but it's prolific and I can't get ahead of it. Any suggestions?
Oh, bindweed. No, sorry, it really is awful. If it's in your lawn, you can deal with it. If it's in your gardens, it's very, very difficult because it becomes intertwined with other things, and it just little teeny fragments of it just keep on coming. Again, persistence almost doesn't seem to work with it. In a lawn, I have dealt with it in areas by simply tarping over areas and starting again. I have some problem plants. I would say creeping bellflower, Campanula rapunculoides, for instance, is one of those that I literally tarped an area for 3 years to get rid of it. Now, most people aren't willing to do that, but for a plant like that, it may look like it just has little fibrous roots, but if you go down deeper, it has these little tuberous rhizomes that just store energy, and the thing can just go dormant for a season. So, you might think you could kill it off by just not letting it photosynthesize, but in fact, yeah, it just sits there and comes back when it perceives light. These are really awful plants, and some of which, again, this is where some pesticide use, but if you were using something like some of the more awful 2,4-D kinds of pesticides, you'd be killing just about everything. So by tarping areas and starting again, you're doing pretty much the same thing. You are doing some damage to subsoils when you cover things up because oxygen exchange stops. But it may be the only solution in those areas outside of just continual and constant hand removal.
Yeesh. Who brought the bindweed to Canada?
Invasive plants are invasive for a reason.
Yes. Okay. So we are running out of time because I'm mindful of everyone's time. We could probably answer questions for another hour. Shelley's asking, butterfly bush, should it be axed?
Leah, yes. Plain and simple. Well, it's one of those plants where, yes, you will see pollinators on it. Yes, it does support the generalists, but it is invasive. It is now forming some stands along Lake Erie. The evidence from there's an organization called CABI. It's a consortium that sort of monitors these things worldwide, and many papers have been written on the subject that says, we can do better. Sure, it's pretty. Yes, it does have some benefits for certain pollinators, but any plant that is going to take up more space, it becomes sort of misplaced. I have an indigenous friend that doesn't like me calling things invasive. He says they're all misplaced, Cathy. They just want to live. And I said, okay, we're misplacing a lot of these from out of our gardens because it isn't going to stay in your garden. And there are alternate choices to support hummingbirds, to support pollinators. Throw a life preserver to the ones that need it.
Well, on that note, I think we'll close our webinar because that's sort of the theme of the talk, that there are alternatives out there and we should be looking for those that are native and not the invasive species. Now, Doris, you had two very specific questions, so I will take those and I'll send those to you, Cathy, if that's okay. And then maybe you and Doris can talk offline.
Okay, and I know there were many questions that came in, you sent me beforehand, we didn't touch upon, and I didn't put in the resource sheet, things about ants and all that. If people want to, go to the McGoy Facebook forum, post them there. I don't always get to everything. I have a talk coming up that I've got to focus on. So, I can't necessarily get to everybody's questions, but, a lot of them were very specific, and hopefully I can give you some advice to help you forward. I know a lot of my answers were not particularly concrete, but it's difficult sometimes.
It is, and you've definitely given us lots of food for thought about how we should be rearranging our gardens, and how we should probably be informing other people, like our neighbors, about, oh, hey, I attended this really interesting webinar. Do you want to hear it? So get rid of that Japanese maple. No, I'm just kidding. I have a Japanese maple. I'm like, oh my gosh, we got it for aesthetic reasons. What was I thinking? Anyway. Cathy, thank you so much for joining us. Everyone who asked a question, who either pre-submitted or who asked a question, thank you for your interest. Thanks to those who are also joining us, whether you're in BC or if you're in the Maritimes or if you're close to McMaster. It's wonderful that our alumni community can come together and learn and share on ways to make our world better. So thank you, everyone. We do have another talk this evening at 7 o'clock that I am also hosting. It is there. Jenna just put that up. We have Michael McDonald, who is a McMaster grad, and he's going to be talking about the Bruce Trail and sort of the Bruce Trail, not only as the wonderful hiking trail that we have here in Southern Ontario, but also, how the Bruce Trail is making an impact on conservation. There we go. So more than a footpath, 60 years of conservation, connection, and community on the Bruce Trail. So if you're interested, take your phone and you can snap that, and that will take you to the registration link. If you can't attend, maybe you still want to register so that you get a link with the recording for that. Anyway, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Cathy. It was wonderful learning from you. I appreciate it. Thanks. Take care, everyone. We'll see you soon.